Have you ever walked into a moment and known your life was about to change? That was how my morning started. I didn't wake up to panic or noise or someone screaming for help. I woke up to absence, to a silence that felt intentional, as though the room had decided to pause before letting me fully return to myself. Our room was never quiet. It breathed with sound, with movement, with small careless noises that meant life was continuing normally. That morning everything felt arranged. Too arranged. Even before I opened my eyes, a weight settled in my chest, the kind that arrives before thought, before logic. Something was wrong. I sat up slowly and looked across the room. Chika's bed was made. Not casually made, but neatly, like she had taken her time. Her slippers were aligned beside the bed instead of flung underneath it. Her bag rested against the wall, zipped, upright. It was all wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. My eyes moved instinctively to her corner, expecting movement, music, anything. There was nothing. No Asa playing softly. No Johnny drill humming from her phone. No gentle off-key singing as she brushed her teeth. The silence pressed against my ears until it became loud. Chika had been my roommate since 200 level. She was the kind of person who entered a room lightly and still managed to change its temperature. Short, fair-skinned, always smiling, always finding humor where others overlooked it. She made friends everywhere without effort, without calculation. People gravitated toward her warmth, not knowing how intentional that warmth was. We weren't the kind of friends who announced our closeness loudly. We became close the way people sharing a space for too long always do. Through shared food, shared clothes, shared complaints about lecturers, shared silence on nights when words felt unnecessary. Through the small trust of knowing someone would lock the door if you fell asleep first. She had sickle cell. She didn't lead with it. If you didn't live with her, you might never know. She refused to let it become the opening sentence of her identity. But living with her meant noticing the things she never said out loud. The way she flinched slightly when harmattan winds crept in. How she always carried a flask of hot water, even when it looked ridiculous under the sun. The way her energy could shift suddenly, her laughter softening, her movements slowing, her lips paling just enough for me to notice. When I asked, she always smiled and said she was fine. And most of the time she believed it. Our mornings followed an unspoken routine. Chika woke before me most days, stretching lazily, reaching for her phone before her eyes were fully open. Music came next. Asa when she wanted calm. Johnny drill when she wanted comfort. Sometimes she'd hum while brushing her teeth. Sometimes she'd dance barefoot on the cold floor. Sometimes she'd just sit on her bed scrolling quietly, wrapped in her blanket. I measured time by her habits without realizing it. Until that morning when all of it was gone. The night before had been ordinary. That was the cruel part. We talked about school, about how tired we were, about food prices rising again. She complained jokingly about how stressful the semester was and how her body seemed to sense exams before her brain did. She laughed it off. We prayed before sleeping like we often did, then drifted into the kind of sleep that comes after exhaustion. Nothing dramatic. Nothing prophetic. Around 2 a.m. she woke me. Not abruptly. Not in panic. Just a gentle tap on my arm. I remember how careful she was, like she didn't want to inconvenience me. "Babe," she whispered. "I day cold. My chest is paining me." Her voice was steady, controlled. She had mastered that tone over time. The tone that acknowledged pain without letting it dominate the room. I was fully awake immediately. I got up, boiled water, poured it into her flask, helped her sit up properly. I gave her painkillers, wrapped her tighter in her blanket. We prayed together, quietly, our voices low and measured. We weren't asking for miracles. Just relief. Just rest. I held her hand because it felt like the most human response. Her palm was cold against mine. Gradually her breathing eased. Her eyes fluttered closed. I slept. I sat there longer than necessary, watching her chest rise and fall, listening for any change in rhythm. When nothing changed, I allowed myself to believe morning would come and everything would reset. I lay back down with that belief folded carefully in my chest. Morning came. Everything else changed. When I finally stood up, my body felt heavy, like it already knew something my mind was still resisting. I crossed the room and called her name softly. No response. I touched her shoulder. She stirred slightly but didn't sit up. When she tried to stand, her legs betrayed her immediately. Her breathing was shallow, labored, like every breath required negotiation. Fear arrived then, sharp and uninvited. I called her coursemate who had a car. We moved quickly but not chaotically. Chika hated chaos. Even in pain, she tried to maintain composure. At the clinic, the smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, something final. The lights were too bright. The walls too white. She struggled for air in a way that stripped me of speech. I stood beside her bed, praying silently, because speaking felt dangerous, like it might fracture something already breaking. She turned her head slightly toward me. Her eyes found mine. She smiled. Not the big smile she used for jokes, but a small one, tired and sincere. "Thank you," she said softly, "for always treating me like normal." I wanted to tell her she was normal, that she was more than her illness, that she wasn't leaving. But words failed me. They failed both of us. Chika died that morning. Her family arrived from Enugu later that day. They moved quietly, efficiently, like people who had rehearsed grief before. They packed her belongings with care, folding clothes gently, pausing sometimes as though memory required permission. Her mother hugged me and thanked me for staying with her daughter. I nodded because my voice had abandoned me completely. When they left, the room felt larger and emptier at the same time. Her bed remained made. Her night cream sat unopened on the table. Her towel hung behind the door, still damp. That night, I lay awake listening to silence where music should have been. Morning came without Asa. Without humming. Without her. School resumed. Life moved forward with a cruelty that felt personal. Lectures continued. Assignments piled up. People talked about everything except death. Inside me something remained suspended. I woke up expecting her voice. I reached for conversations that no longer existed. Her side of the room stayed untouched longer than necessary. None of us had the courage to erase her presence yet. One afternoon, weeks later, I opened her locker. I didn't plan to. I just needed to confirm she had been real. Inside everything was neat. Her notes. Her pink water bottle. Folded clothes. Then I saw it. A small folded paper with my name written on it. My hand shook as I opened it. Her handwriting was soft, rounded, unmistakably hers. Thank me. For seeing her beyond her illness. For making her feel human. For sharing food, laughter, and silence. She told me not to carry guilt. She asked me to tell her story. I sat on the floor and cried until my chest ached. That was when grief truly began. After that day, time stopped behaving normally. Days passed, but they didn't arrive or leave the way they used to. They hovered. They lingered. They waited for me to catch up to a reality I had no intention of accepting. I moved through lectures like a visitor. I sat in class and copied notes without reading them, my handwriting unfamiliar to me, as though someone else had borrowed my hand. People spoke around me, laughed near me, complained about tests and food and stress, and I watched it all from a distance I couldn't explain. Grief had not made me loud or dramatic. It had made me quiet, observant, careful. It had pressed a pause button on my emotions and left everything else running. Returning to the room each evening felt like walking into a museum exhibit curated by memory. Nothing had changed, and that was the problem. Chika's bed still carried the faint scent of her lotion. Her towel remained behind the door because I couldn't bring myself to move it. I kept expecting her to walk in one evening, drop her bag on the chair, and ask why I was looking at her like I'd seen a ghost. I imagined her laughing and calling me dramatic. I imagined relief. I imagined a version of reality that refused to exist. People tried to comfort me in the ways they knew how. Some avoided mentioning her name, afraid it might break me. Others mentioned her too much, repeating the same condolences until they felt rehearsed. He nodded. I smiled when expected. I said I was fine because explaining the truth felt exhausting. Grief did not need an audience. It needed space. I carried mine quietly. At night sleep became unreliable. When it came, it was shallow. When it didn't, memories filled the silence. I remembered how Chika used to sit cross-legged on her bed, reading notes aloud as if the information stuck better when shared. I remembered how she chewed the handle of her pink comb absent-mindedly while studying, leaving tiny marks that made me scold her. I remembered how she hated being treated differently, how she insisted on carrying her own load even when her body was struggling. She wanted normalcy more than sympathy. And somehow she had achieved it. Weeks passed like this. Then one afternoon, the room felt heavier than usual. I stood in front of her locker again, staring at it longer than necessary. It wasn't curiosity that drew me there this time. It was longing. I wanted to feel close to her, even if it meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar. I opened the locker slowly, as if speed might erase what was inside. Everything was still neat. Exactly how she left it. I touched her clothes, her books, her water bottle. Each item felt like proof that she had existed beyond memory. That was when I noticed something else. A small notebook tucked behind her notes. I hadn't seen it before. My chest tightened as I pulled it out. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't filled with secrets or dramatic confessions. It was a simple notebook. Appointment dates. Medication reminders. Short prayers scribbled between notes. On one page, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "I want to live well, even if I don't live long." I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest, the air leaving my lungs in a quiet rush. She had known. Maybe not the day or the hour, but she had known the fragility of time better than most of us ever would. Grief shifted after that. It stopped being only about loss and started becoming something heavier. Responsibility. Chika had asked me to tell her story. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just honestly. At first I didn't know how. I barely knew how to survive my own days, let alone carry someone else's memory with intention. But slowly I began to notice people differently. I listened more carefully when someone said they were fine. I noticed the pauses in laughter, the tired eyes behind smiles. I realized how easy it was to overlook pain when it didn't announce itself. Nearly 4 months after Chika died, the room changed again. A new roommate arrived. Her name was Ifioma. She entered the room with energy that felt almost disruptive at first. She talked easily, laughed loudly, played music without headphones. Ira Star filled the space in the mornings instead of Asa. At first, I resented the noise. It felt like an intrusion. But Ifioma was gentle in ways that mattered. She asked before touching anything. She cleaned without complaint. She tried, carefully, to include me without forcing conversation. Slowly I adjusted. Life, persistent and stubborn, insisted on continuing. Grief didn't leave when Ifioma arrived. Simply learned how to coexist. Some mornings were easier. Others hit without warning. One Sunday morning, sunlight streamed into the room in a way that felt almost intentional. I sat on my bed, watching dust dance in the air, when something on the windowsill caught my attention. Flash of pink. My heart stuttered. I stood slowly, as if sudden movement might make it disappear. It was Chika's comb. The same pink comb with the crack near the handle. The same bite marks I recognized instantly. I hadn't seen it since her family packed her things. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was real. Solid. Warm from the sunlight. I didn't tell anyone. Couldn't. I told myself it was stress, memory playing tricks. Grief refusing to let go. The next day, I opened my locker and froze. Folded neatly inside was a yellow wrapper with sunflower prints. The same one I had watched her mother pack. The same one I had convinced myself was gone. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I closed the locker slowly and sat on my bed, staring at nothing. Logic offered no comfort. Neither did denial. On the third morning it happened again. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. Laugh. Reef. Familiar in a way that made my knees weak. I turned so fast my toothbrush slipped from my mouth and hit the sink. The room was empty. The air was still. I stood there shaking, my reflection staring back at me like it had questions I couldn't answer. That was when I cried properly for the first time. Not the quiet tears I had perfected, but the kind that left my chest aching and my head pounding. The kind that emptied you out completely. That night I played Asa again. I sat in Chika's old corner, the one she used to claim without discussion, and whispered that I missed her. I didn't ask why she appeared in fragments or what she wanted. I just spoke. When I finally told Ifioma everything the next day, she didn't laugh or dismiss me. She listened. She held my hand and said softly that maybe some people don't leave completely. Maybe they just change the way they stay. That night we lit a candle. One flame. One song. One quiet acknowledgement of a presence that refused to be erased. I didn't feel afraid. I felt comforted. As though Chika wanted me to know that I wasn't alone in remembering her. From then on, something shifted inside me. I started volunteering at the clinic when I could. I wrote about sickle cell warriors not as victims, but as people who lived fully within borrowed time. I learned to listen beyond words. To see beyond smiles. To treat people as whole, even when their bodies betrayed them. Because that was what Chika had taught me without trying. She never wanted pity. She wanted to live. And in leaving, she left me with a way of seeing the world more honestly. She was my roommate. She was my friend. And she changed the way I understood presence, absence, and the quiet strength it takes to keep smiling when life is heavy. After the candle burned down that night, the room never quite returned to being just a room. It became a space layered with memory, with meaning, with things unsaid but deeply felt. I stopped questioning the small signs. I stopped trying to explain them away. Instead, I carried them quietly, the way Chika had carried her pain. Life demanded routine, and I learned how to meet it without betraying my grief. I went to lectures. I submitted assignments. I laughed when appropriate. But there was a new attentiveness in me, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. I noticed how fragile people were beneath their noise. How easily we missed the important things while chasing the urgent ones. Sometimes, in class, my mind drifted back to our room in 200 level. I remembered late nights when we sat on the floor eating bread and tea because neither of us felt like cooking. I remembered how Chika loved asking questions in class, not because she wanted attention, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. I remembered her frustration when her body slowed her down, how she hid it behind jokes and lightness. "My body day do anyhow today," she'd say, laughing, as though it was nothing more than an inconvenience. I wondered how many people around me were saying the same thing silently. The seasons changed, and with them the weather. Harmattan came again, sharp and dry, and every time the cold crept in, I thought of her. I found myself instinctively reaching for hot water, even when I didn't need it. Her habits had woven themselves into my own. Carried tissues everywhere. I dressed warmer than before. I listened to my body more carefully. Grief had taught me vigilance. One afternoon, while cleaning the room, I found another reminder. Tucked behind a stack of books was one of her handwritten notes, a rough draft of something she never finished. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just thoughts scattered across the page. She wrote about wanting to travel, about wanting to fall in love without being afraid her illness would scare someone away, about wanting to be remembered for her laughter, not her hospital visits. I sat on the floor again, holding the paper, realizing how little time we truly have to say the things we mean. Ifioma noticed the changes in me long before I spoke about them. She noticed how I paused before answering questions, how I sometimes stared too long at nothing. She never pressured me to explain. Instead, she matched my silence with patience. Sometimes she played her music softly instead of loud. Sometimes she joined me in listening to Asa. Without saying it, she made room for Chika too. That kindness mattered more than she probably knew. As months passed, I began to speak Chika's name again without my throat tightening every time. I told her story in small ways. To a classmate who mentioned having sickle cell and laughed it off. To a friend who complained about a friend being too quiet. I told them about a girl who smiled through storms, who lived fully even when her body made it difficult. I watched people listen differently when the story was personal, when it had a face, name. On Chika's birthday I kept my promise. I played Bibank. I lit a candle. I spoke her name out loud. The ritual grounded me. It reminded me that remembrance didn't have to be loud to be meaningful. Sometimes it just needed intention. There were still difficult days. Days when grief returned unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a scent, a laugh that sounded too familiar. But there were also days when remembering her made me smile instead of ache. I learned that grief wasn't something to overcome. It was something to carry, something that reshaped you without asking permission. One evening, while volunteering at the clinic, I met a young girl sitting quietly beside her mother. She smiled at me the way Chika used to, with a warmth that felt practiced. When I spoke to her, I noticed the familiar signs. Flask. The careful movements. Quiet strength. I sat with her longer than necessary, listening, treating her like she was whole. When she smiled wider and relaxed, I felt something settle inside me. This was what Chika had left me with. Not sorrow alone but purpose. As time stretched forward, I understood something I hadn't before. Some people arrive in our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us how to see. Chika taught me how to see beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, beyond the easy narratives we tell ourselves about strength and weakness. She taught me that joy can exist alongside pain, that laughter can be an act of defiance, that living fully is not measured by length but by depth. Even now, years later, her presence lingers in quiet ways. In the songs I choose. In the patience I offer. In the attention I give to small details others overlook. She is there in the pauses between conversations, in the moments when I decide to stay instead of leaving, to listen instead of dismissing, to treat someone like they are normal when the world insists on defining them by their struggles. Chika was my roommate. She was my friend. She was a lesson I didn't ask for but will carry forever. And in remembering her, I learned something essential about life. That some people don't need a long time to leave a permanent mark. They just need to be seen, truly seen while they are here.